North Carolina has over 130 people on death row. Blanche Moore, 33 years on death row. Blanche Taylor Moore is the oldest woman currently incarcerated on death row. She is 91 years old. Born Blanche Kisser, she was the daughter of mail worker, ordained Baptist minister, and womanizer Parker D. Kisser. He was an alcoholic who subsequently drove her into prostitution to cover his debts from gambling. Kisser passed away in 1966 with a heart attack being listed as the reason. She married the soldier and furniture restorer James Napoleon Taylor in 1952, and the two had 2 children in 1953 and 1959. She worked as a cashier at Kroger in 1954. By 1959, she had advanced to the highest position attainable for a female employee at Kroger, head cashier, which is essentially the modern equivalent of customer service manager. She started an affair with Raymond Reed, the store manager, in 1962. Taylor passed away shortly after Moore and Reed started dating. Once more, a heart attack was listed as the cause. The two started dating in public after her husband passed away in 1971, but their relationship had worsened by 1985. It appears that she started dating Kevin Denton, the regional manager for the Triad area. Nevertheless, after their breakup, Moore sued Denton and Kroger in October 1985 for alleged sexual harassment. After Denton was compelled to step down, Kroger paid $275,000 to settle the lawsuit outside of court 2 years later. Before leaving Kroger, Moore met Reverend Dwight Moore. However, she was forced to conceal her relationship with Reverend Moore due to the fact that she claimed in her case against Kroger to be completely alienated and antagonistic towards men and has not been able to maintain any meaningful social contacts with the opposite sex. She asked Reverend Moore to get her some arsenic-based ant killer when they were dating. Moore further charged an unidentified person in 1985 of igniting 2 fires that caused damage in her mobile home. Reed experienced what was first thought to be shingles in 1986. That April, he was admitted to the hospital, and on October 7, 1986, he passed away. Physicians concluded that Guillain-Barré syndrome was the cause of death. Soon after Reed passed away, Blanche and Reverend Dwight Moore started dating in public. The pair wed on April 19, 1989, and spent a long weekend in New Jersey. On Monday, they went back, and on Wednesday, following a chicken sandwich, Reverend Moore became very ill. The cause, according to medical professionals, was arsenic poisoning. Subsequent investigation revealed that Reverend Moore was exposed to the highest amount of arsenic from which a victim managed to survive. Following notifications to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, Taylor, Reed, and her father were exhumed. All of the bodies had high levels of arsenic according to later autopsy. It was also revealed that Raymond Reed had a toxicology screen request by Baptist hospital physicians. His body had a significant amount of arsenic according to the results, but the resident in charge of Reed's care rotated to a different hospital on the day the test results were returned, and the new resident never forwarded the information up the chain of command. Reed consequently took the last lethal doses of arsenic in his hospital bed. When the SBI learned that Blanche Moore had attempted to have Dwight Moore's pension modified to make her the primary recipient, they were suspicious of her. They were also aware that she had misrepresented the amount of money she had gotten from Raymond Reed's estate. Blanche Moore said in interviews that Dwight Moore and Raymond Reed were unhappy and had likely been abusing arsenic, which was deemed to be extremely unlikely. It also turned out that at the time Moore was dating Dwight Moore, she was still having affairs with Reed. In an effort to stop the SBI from obtaining hair samples, Blanche also had Dwight's hair chopped. Instead, private area's hair samples were used. Blanche Taylor Moore was detained and accused of Raymond Reed's first-degree murder on July 18, 1989. Because they believed they could demonstrate that she fed Reed pudding laced with arsenic, prosecutors decided to charge her with Reed's death rather than trying to kill Dwight Moore. In Dwight Moore's case, it was more challenging to identify the person poisoning him because medical professionals had identified the symptoms of arsenic poisoning early on. Other potential victims include a number of close friends and family who inexplicably passed away while exhibiting some symptoms of arsenic poisoning, but none of them had been dug up for additional analysis. Her mother-in-law, Isla Taylor, is among the other likely victims. Jerry Connor, 33 years on death row. For the 1990 essay and murder of Min Rogers and her 16-year-old daughter Linda, Connor received a death sentence. He admitted to the police that he had essayed someone, but his lawyers said he was untrustworthy and only little mentally handicapped. Connor's 1995 trial used the essay conviction as support for the death penalty. His confession to the police matched information from the crime scene, and his shoe print was discovered in the girl's blood. Clinton Rose, 33 years on death row. Rose was a prison escapee from Alabama, having been convicted of the 1973 murder of a Tennessee man and given a life sentence. Later, he was found guilty on 2 charges of murder and robbery in connection with the June 1990 killings of Reidsville resident Larry Connor, 31, and Stoneville resident Richard Connor, 39. A close-range shotgun fire murdered the Connors when they were camped near the Virginia state border in northwest Rockingham County along the Mayo River. A few days after their deaths, their remains were discovered, zipped inside their tent. Edward Davis, 32 years on death row. In 1992, Davis was found guilty of killing Mark Ronald Lane with a gun during a heist at the pawn shop Lane's father operated in Leicester. Lane pulled a revolver on the would-be robber and was shot 3 times. 10 months prior to the murder, in Ohio, Davis had been granted parole for a 1975 murder in which, as part of a break-in, he fatally stabbed a man in order to take his television. Kenneth Roos, 32 years on death row. In Randall County Superior Court, Roos, 41 at the time, was given a death sentence for the murder of Hazel Colleen Broadway on March 16, 1991. Broadway, 63, was the victim of a robbery, essay attempt, and murder committed by Roos inside the Nashboro Pantry convenience store. Blood was discovered all over Broadway. Her body bore the imprints of hands. Her jeans were pushed down to her feet, and she wore a blouse. A knife was embedded in her neck. The knife's blade was bent at a 90-degree angle directly beneath the handle. Wayne Laws, 39 years on death row. For committing 2 murders in 1985, the state of North Carolina sentenced Laws to death. Court records state that Wayne Laws killed Ronnie Waddle, 35, and James Kepley, 57, by beating them. A hammer had been used to viciously assault both individuals. I found a report stating that Laws died in prison last year, but I couldn't confirm the info with other sources, and even so, being the longest-serving death row inmate in this state, I felt it was important to mention him. Nathan Bowie, 31 years on death row. William Bowie, 31 years on death row. Bowie was charged on July 22, 1991, with the first-degree murders of Nelson Roger Shufford and Calvin Lee Wilson. Nathan Bowie and co-defendant William Barfield Bowie were both tried on a capital charge. Nelson Shufford and Calvin Wilson were approached by Nathan Bowie's aunt, Rochelle Bowie, and uncle William Barfield Bowie on May 23, 1991, at approximately 11 p.m. A fight broke out between Shufford and Rochelle. William and Rochelle turned to go, strolling down the street, when they heard a gunshot from behind them. According to evidence, Rochelle and William thought Shufford and Wilson were shooting at them when Calvin Wilson fired his gun into the air. The next day, Nathan, who was 20 years old at the time, and his uncle William murdered the 2 men. Shufford had a single gunshot wound to the chest. There was testimony indicating that a bullet with a big caliber caused the wound. Wilson was shot twice, once in the head, just above his ear, and once in the right upper back. Wilson was on the ground when one of the shooters moved within 6 or 7 feet of him after he had fallen. Testimony indicated that the head wound measured more than the back wound. When the cops arrived, Wilson was unconscious but still alive, lying on his side. A few days later, he passed away in the hospital. Norfolk Best, 31 years on death row. On November 30, 1991, Leslie and Gertrude Baldwin were murdered at their Whiteville residence, according to the prosecution. A few days later, their remains were discovered. The body of well-known professional photographer Leslie Baldwin, 82, was discovered on the floor of a hallway that led to a bedroom. On her bed, Gertrude Baldwin, 77, was discovered. On June 4, 1993, Best was found guilty of their murders and given the death penalty. James Campbell, 31 years on death row. Catherine Price's body was discovered in a field in Rowan County, North Carolina, on September 11, 1992. Price's neck had been stabbed 22 times. James Adolph Campbell was taken into custody by North Carolina authorities 5 days after the murder. After he admitted his guilt, he pointed the authorities towards several tangible pieces of evidence, such as the knife that killed Catherine. Campbell gave the police a detailed and precise confession. He acknowledged doing the following. The first time Campbell saw Catherine was on September 8, 1992. He was looking for a weapon on this particular day in order to murder himself and Tina, his ex-girlfriend, whom he had essayed 2 days prior. Catherine Price offered Campbell a ride when she noticed him strolling down the street the following morning. He consented to her invitation. He forced her into a remote spot and put a knife to her throat as she was driving. Campbell came to the conclusion that he would murder Catherine. Even though she supposedly consented when he offered to have sex, he clarified that in the given situation, you could call it essay. Campbell had essayed Catherine twice before using such force to choke her in her car that one of his thumbs became numb. Then he used a sliver of Catherine's shirt to strangle her. But Catherine's clothing was torn and she was still breathing, so this was insufficient to actually kill her. Taking Catherine out of the car, Campbell laid her down where her body was found later on, saying, "I took my knife and stabbed her in the side of her throat. She continued to groan and moan as I sat there and watched the blood pour out of her throat. I wanted her to die, so I stabbed her numerous more times." After stealing Catherine's vehicle, Campbell carried on looking for a gun. He went to see a woman in the evening who he had been seeing since July. After arriving at Catherine Price's car, Campbell set it on fire. Subsequently, in front of the police, Campbell said that he killed Catherine Price because he had failed to murder Tina. George Buckner, 31 years on death row. In 1993, George Cale Buckner, then 38, was found guilty of Eddie Dow's murder after Dow was shot 3 times with an SKS assault rifle that belonged to Buckner's brother. In the case, Buckner was found guilty of robbery as well. During his trial, Buckner testified that he was a police informant attempting to gather information regarding narcotics activity and that the trigger was pulled by a different individual. According to the 3 people who were with Buckner, he was the one who actually pulled the trigger. Randy Atkins, 31 years on death row. He admitted to killing his 8-month-old son, Lyle Atkins, in 1993. He hit the infant 2 or 3 times against the wall of the Woodfin caravan that he and the child's mother shared, and he struck the infant several times on the side of the head. He said he bit the child to put an end to its sobbing. Medical experts said that Lyle's body had almost all fractured long bones, calling it the worst example of battered kid syndrome they had ever seen. Frank Chambers, 30 years on death row. In the murders of a Tutoro couple, Chambers, Robert Louis Blakeney, and William Leroy Barnes were found guilty of first-degree murder. For their armed robberies and burglaries, Chambers and Barnes received death sentences in addition to 120 years in prison. Blakeney was given the same 120-year sentence plus 2 consecutive life terms. In 2021, Barnes was resentenced to life in prison. Jeffrey Candies, 30 years on death row. Natalie Lynn Osborne, 4 years old, was essayed and killed by Candies. He was dating Natalie's mother. Her battered and nude body was found in a garbage bag in her home's closet. Candies said he unintentionally ran her over with his car. Natalie had been essayed and severely beaten, according to the autopsy. Candies was found guilty of first-degree child essay as well. Wade Cole, 30 years on death row. Cole was found guilty twice of killing his 2 children's mother, Teresa Graham, on June 23, 1988. Graham was 30 years old at the time. Additionally, he received 2 death sentences. Cole was twice found guilty of involuntary manslaughter in the death of Hattie Graham, who suffered a heart attack after being stabbed while attempting to protect her daughter. For the most of their approximately 15-year relationship, Cole and Teresa Graham shared a home in Camden County with Graham's mother. The couple had 2 kids, aged 2 and 11. Graham's 12-year-old cousin was also staying at the house the night of the murder. On June 22, 1988, at 5:30 p.m., Cole wanted to know where dinner was when he got home from work. He struck Graham with his fist and started beating her. Hattie Graham tried to step in, but Cole hit her and threw her against the car. On suspicion of assault, Cole was taken into custody that evening and was told to avoid the house. Yet, he came back at around 1:30 in the morning and used the back door to break into the house. According to court documents, he tore out the telephone connection before dragging Teresa Graham out of a bedroom and shooting her in the face and leg with a rifle. After dragging Graham's body into the dining room, Cole went to the kitchen for a knife and he started stabbing her. Later, he carried Graham's body onto a porch while stabbing her more. Graham had been stabbed over 100 times, according to the autopsy, before Cole fled the scene. The 11-year-old kid of Graham's cousin connected the phone again. After being stabbed while attempting to protect her daughter, Hattie Graham passed away from a heart attack. Warren Gregory, 31 years on death row. Gregory was found guilty of kidnapping, essay, and murder and given the death penalty. Gregory was assigned to Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina, along with 2 other Marines. The men went out for a drive and they met 2 women and another man. Warren Gregory offered to drive the group, but they did not accept. Gregory drove away, but he quickly turned around and came back towards the group, this time brandishing a shotgun. Warren Gregory shot the man in the face and forced the 2 women inside the vehicle. The women were taken to a secluded area where they suffered from essay and then they were killed. Alden Harden, 30 years on death row. Harden received the death penalty for the October 1993 murders of 2 Charlotte Mecklenburg police officers, Andy Nobles and John Burnett. His attorneys have argued that he killed them in self-defense during a struggle.
These were 2 kids that could be anybody's 2 kids. They were kids. They were in their 20s, and they were kids who could do anything. They were talented, attractive, bright, ambitious young men who could do anything they wanted to do.
John Burnett and Andy Nobles, it was quite a team. They worked great together.
One of those guys, perhaps both of them, would have been a chief of police. If he had done something else, he'd been a president of a bank. He'd been a success in whatever field. And yet they had decided what they wanted to do was be policemen.
They really wanted to make a difference out there.
Knock, knock. Yeah. How are you?
John was just one of a kind. He was wide open, and he could make you laugh in a heartbeat.
You know, John had all the enthusiasm in the world. I mean, he was just go, 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 and you write the program up, I'm gonna go do it, you know?
I remember being in little tussles with people out on the street with John, and John would do something which was funny. I mean, after it was all over with, we'd get into something, and then he'd be out there trying to make the guy's best friend, you know? And the guys just tried to, hurt him, and John wants to make him his friend.
And she told me about her little son, who now is about 2 years old. She said that every Friday that John came to check on her just to make sure that she was okay, and they brought diapers to her little boy.
They came to my house several times, which I respect them as police officers, but, we're just like a family.
John never met a stranger.
Andy thought of himself as a minister. He has a brother who is a minister, and Andy told his dad that he thought what he was doing was every bit as important in carrying out the work of the Lord in terms of ministering to the young children in the community in which he was working.
To me, Andy is a hard person to describe because you can make him sound like a fairy tale, how good he was, how nice he was.
If he couldn't make a job, he'd call me, and he knew he can depend on me, and I knew I could depend on him. And that that was kind of relationship, you know, that we had.
One of his friends said that he could take all of Andy's friends and put them together in a room and they wouldn't have anything in common except Andy.
When I think of Andy, I think about the all-American guy. Very good-looking, good shape, loved being a cop, excellent police officer. Just was, always had a smile on his face.
And the reason that he wanted to help the neighborhoods was because of the children and the elderly people, the people that couldn't help themselves.
Philip Wilkinson, 30 years on death row. A young soldier named Philip Wilkinson entered the Fayetteville, North Carolina police station in January 1992 and stated that he was troubled by his conscience. In the end, he admitted to a triple homicide that occurred 6 months earlier, shocking the expanding military community and leaving authorities hunting for the perpetrator. According to a Fayetteville police investigator, Wilkinson, 24 at the time, explained what happened while speaking in an even tone and without displaying any obvious signs of regret. Wilkinson observed 19-year-old Crystal Hudson dozing off in her family's couch through sliding glass doors. He told police that after breaking into the house and caressing her, he started pounding her on the head with a bowling pin he had found in the yard. After that, he entered the bedroom where he discovered Larry Hudson Jr., age 11, and Judy Hudson, age 38, the mother. He murdered them with brutal assaults. Judy Hudson experienced SA, as did her daughter. James Thomas, 29 years on death row. Early in 1986, Thomas moved into the Raleigh, North Carolina-based Sir Walter Tourist Home. He made friends with Teresa West, the home's manager, while he was a resident. Thomas and his fiancée relocated to Cary, North Carolina in June of that year. Thomas was a heroin addict, so on the evening of June 13, he drove to the tourist house in a friend's car to visit West, who had informed Thomas that she had some heroin. Following an unsuccessful attempt to obtain cocaine for injection alongside the heroin, Thomas went to West's room and administered the heroin injection. In addition, he injected and dissolved several medications that West provided him. Thomas said during the trial that West approached him when she was only partially dressed and wanted to have relations. Thomas declined, citing his incapacity as a result of the heroin and his commitment to his fiancée. Thomas states that when West tried to start an argument, he passed out. West was dead when he woke up and Thomas left. A phone receiver that had been placed into West's private area was discovered within her body. The autopsy's forensic specialist testified that West was physically and with pantyhose strangled and that the phone receiver was most likely inserted after her death. Charles Bond, 29 years on death row. Despite not being there when Wayne Thomas, 25, was shot and killed, Bond was given a death sentence. He was 46 years old at the time, and he had given an alleged accomplice the order to assassinate Thomas hours before the murder. Bond was sitting in a hospital room a mile away when the guns fired. Darrell Woods, 29 years on death row. The state of North Carolina condemned Woods to death for the essay and killing of Trey Devon Gibson. Court records state that Darrell Woods broke into Trey Devon Gibson's home, essayed her, and then killed her. Gibson's body was autopsied by Dr. Donald Jason, who stated in his testimony that there were burns on the lower back, right buttock, and left upper thigh, in addition to 20 stab wounds to the neck, 8 sharp wounds to the neck, and 5 stab wounds to the mid-chest. The burns had the appearance of having been caused by a curling iron. Torture is consistent with the incisions appearing to have been created with the intention of severing the skin of the neck. Trey Gibson would have suffered greatly from the stabbings. She bled to death. According to Dr. Jason's testimony, that would have happened within 15 to 30 minutes. Timothy Richardson, 29 years on death row. The state of North Carolina sentenced Richardson to death for killing Tracy Marie Rich. Richardson killed Tracy Rich while robbing a convenience store, according to court filings. On a rural road not far from the business, the victim's body was discovered stuck under her vehicle. The victim's glasses and tennis shoe were discovered in the road close to the vehicle. The glasses looked like they had been hit by a car. Richard Cagle, 29 years on death row. Cagle received a death sentence for a robbery murder. In court records, it is stated that Ricky Cagle and his associates chose to murder Dennis Craig House in order to rob him. Terry Hyatt, 24 years on death row. For the 1979 robberies, essays, and killings of Betty Sue McConnell and Harriet Delaney Simmons, Hyatt was given 2 death sentences in 2000. The case remained unsolved until 1998, when a guy entered the sheriff's office and acknowledged assisting Hyatt in kidnapping a woman. He was the last individual in Buncombe County to receive a death sentence. Jason Wayne Hurst, 20 years on death row. Hurst killed Daniel Lee Branch after robbing him. Branch was a devoted husband and father who worked hard for his family. He was trying to raise money by selling a number of guns. Hurst got in touch with him and said he wanted to purchase the guns. Branch consented to show Hurst how the guns operated by taking him to a remote area. Hurst shot Branch with a shotgun as he entered the field to set up a target. After falling, Branch got up and ran for his life. Hurst shot him once more. Then Hurst stood over Branch as the man was pleading for his life. He shot him in the face a 3rd time. After taking the car and its keys out of Branch's pocket, Hurst drove to West Virginia with the stolen guns. John Scott Badgett, 20 years on death row. J.C. Crisco was murdered by Badgett after he robbed him in his home. Badgett had nowhere to live. Crisco had consented to let him temporarily reside at his house. Crisco was stabbed in the throat by Badgett, who then followed him around the home while he bled to death, even pushing him to the ground when he attempted to cry for help. Badgett asserted his right to self-defense, saying that Crisco had grown enraged and was cursing at him. Badgett returned to the house after killing Crisco and proceeded to steal and sell goods from it. Badgett had stabbed another victim in the throat years prior and had been found guilty of manslaughter. He had a violent past in which he had beaten and stabbed multiple people. Alexander Polk, 19 years on death row. Sheriff's Deputy Tony Clayton Summy was killed by Polk. Additionally, he shot Deputy Nathan Hollingsworth, injuring him. To execute an arrest warrant for Polk's non-attendance at district court, Deputies Summy and Hollingsworth went to his residence. Polk pulled his gun from its holster and started fighting with Deputy Summy. The deputy was then fatally shot by him many times. Following their altercation, Polk tried to kill Deputy Hollingsworth by using Deputy Summy's handgun. Deputy Hollingsworth and Polk engaged in a close-quarters gunfight when Polk fired a shot that hit him in the upper arm. George Thomas Wilkerson, 18 years on death row. Wilkerson killed Christopher Cameron Voncannon and Casey James Dinoff. Drug dealer Wilkerson was a vicious man. He thought that he was owed a modest sum of money for a narcotics deal by one of the victims. He acquired an SKS gun with full auto-firing capability. He drove to the victim's house at night, disconnected the power cables leading to it, and then opened fire, murdering the 2 people. On the couch, one was fast asleep. Wilkerson boasted of having killed people and claimed to have felt like a Navy SEAL. Russell Tucker, 28 years on death row. For the first-degree murder of Maurice Trevone Williams, he was given a death penalty. On December 8, 1994, at about 10 o'clock at night, Tucker was seen stealing items from the Kmart on University Parkway in Winston-Salem. Tucker was approached by Williams and another security guard, at which point Tucker fired and killed Williams. Tucker is currently serving terms for second-degree murder and armed robbery in connection with the shooting death of Winston-Salem taxi driver Richard Wall on November 9, 1994, in addition to his death sentence. Guy Legrand, 28 years on death row. Ellen Munford was shot twice in the back by Guy Tobias Legrand on July 27, 1993, in her house. Legrand, who was 34, was employed at Jay's Downtowner restaurant in Albemarle alongside Tommy Munford, the victim's spouse. Legrand and Tommy Munford plotted Ellen Munford's murder. Ellen and Munford have not spoken to each other for 2 years. Ellen was living with a different man at the time of the murder. Munford had been invading Ellen's new boyfriend's property, harassing her on a regular basis and trespassing. Munford made no secret of his desire to do in the victim. Munford obtained a $50,000 life insurance policy on Ellen, designating himself as the only beneficiary. He promised to pay LeGrand $6,500 if he would kill Ellen Munford. Munford planned to leave Ellen Munford alone in the house on the day of the murder by taking their 2 kids to the beach. Munford dropped LeGrand off in the woods near Ellen's house before going to pick up the kids. LeGrand had a shotgun with him. Munford let LeGrand know that Ellen was alone as he was leaving her residence by honking his horn. Before LeGrand killed Ellen Munford, he spent hours observing her from the woods. Archie Billings, 28 years on death row. On July 7, 1995, at 1:50 a.m., Robert Jackson left his mobile home in Caswell County to gather and prepare a herd of cows for milking. Bobby, age 13, and Amy, age 11, were asleep in their beds when Jackson left them. Archie Billings broke into the mobile home somewhere between 1:50 and 4:50 in the morning, giving Bobby several knife stab wounds before starting to attack Amy. After fumbling with a kitchen phone, Bobby dialed 911. Bobby was found on the kitchen floor in a pool of his own blood when emergency personnel arrived at 5 a.m. Roughly 23 times had Billings stabbed the boy. Nevertheless, Bobby lived to tell the tale, having recognized Billings as the assailant who had stabbed him and carried his sister out of the mobile home. Amy's body was discovered in a field about 12 hours later, with her pajama top partially pulled off and her pajama pants wrapped around her feet. Amy's carotid artery was severed in a throat stabbing that claimed her life. Amy had also experienced SA, according to the autopsy. On the dairy farm, Billings collaborated with Jackson, and the 2 kids became acquainted with him. Billings was taken into custody by sheriff's deputies the same morning the kids were attacked. Elrico Fowler, 27 years on death row. Bobby Richmond was a worker at a Howard Johnson's motel in Charlotte, and on New Year's Eve of 1995, Elrico Darnell Fowler killed him during an armed robbery. A second worker suffered critical injuries. Ted Prevate, 25 years on death row, for killing Cynthia Bacon McIntyre, his girlfriend, outside her Anson County, North Carolina home in 1993. Ted Anthony Prevate received a death sentence. That occurred 20 years after Prevate was found guilty of killing James Rouse Jr. and robbing him with a gun in Atlanta in 1974. Back then, he was given a death sentence, but the Georgia Supreme Court reversed it in 1991, allowing him to be released on parole. Raymond Thibodeau, 25 years on death row. After paying a few bills and getting her automobile ready for the 1,000-mile travel, Bertha Annette Hyatt Thibodeau announced to her friends and relatives that she intended to leave her abusive husband and move back to Texas. The mother of 2, whose curly auburn hair reached her shoulders, was not going to make it out of North Carolina alive. In their white wood frame house a few miles outside of High Point, her husband, 43-year-old Raymond Thibodeau, killed her on Easter Sunday by hitting her skull up to 100 times with a hammer. Lyle May, 25 years on death row. Due to 2 counts of first-degree murder in which a 24-year-old woman and her 4-year-old child were killed, Lyle May is currently detained on death row in North Carolina. He was just 21 years old when he got the death penalty. While incarcerated, May has also developed into a prolific journalist, landing stories and articles in publications including Scalawag Magazine, Inside Higher Education, and the Marshall Project. Carlette Parker, 25 years on death row. Alice Covington, an 88-year-old woman, was abducted by home healthcare provider Carlette Parker, who then took money out of her account and drowned her in a bathtub. Upon examination, Covington showed signs of burns from a stun gun, pepper spray on her clothes, and bruises around her ankles and legs. Parker was carrying pepper spray and a stun gun when she was taken into custody. She admitted guilt to 16 felonies in 1985 for the fraudulent acquisition of property from 85-year-old Catherine Stevenson, who was under Parker's care. $44,000 worth of fake bank withdrawal slips were produced by her. Covington's body was found in the front seat of her car parked in a wooded area in Morrisville. Nathaniel Fair, 25 years on death row. Nathaniel Fair Jr. killed Wake County Assistant Principal Reuben McNeil in the first degree. Fair was also found guilty of using a deadly weapon during a robbery. His attorneys insisted that McNeil was stabbed by T-Bone, a local drug dealer. The prosecution presented a stronger argument. Numerous tangible pieces of evidence, including a stolen Explorer and samples of Fair's blood on McNeil's clothing, were crucial. James Janes, 25 years on death row. Jimmy Janes was given the death penalty by a jury in 1990 for the murder of Paul Aker, a cattle farmer in Polk County. At the age of 22, Janes shot Paul Frederick Aker, broke into his house and farm, and set fire to his body. In 1989, Aker, a construction contractor, moved out of his hometown of New York to pursue his lifelong ambition of operating a cow farm in a small village. James Little, 16 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of a cab driver. Jamal Bacote, 15 years on death row. At the age of 19, Jamal Bacote attempted a robbery in February 2007 by breaking into a home in Selma, North Carolina with another guy. There were 6 individuals inside, including Anthony Searles, a senior in high school who was 18 years old. After being shot, he died. Although his murder was not planned, Bacote was convicted in 2009 and given a death by lethal injection sentence based on his extensive criminal history as a teenager. Andrew Darren Ramsor, 14 years on death row. He was indicted on December 31, 2007, with 2 charges of first-degree murder and 1 count of robbery with a dangerous weapon in relation to the killings of Jeffrey Robert Peck and Jennifer Lee Vinsek on December 16, 2007. In 2010, he was found guilty on 2 charges of first-degree murder and given the death penalty. Stephen Buckner, 14 years on death row. Around 10 in the morning, gunshots were heard at Stephen Monroe Buckner's residence, prompting the authorities to respond. Buckner opened fire on the officers as they approached. They hurt him by firing back. Within the residence, 3 bodies were discovered by the detectives. They were Vicki Lynn Lowery, a 42-year-old live-in girlfriend of Buckner, Lowery's 14-year-old daughter, Chelsea Nicole Gregory, and Buckner's own 25-year-old daughter, Rebecca Rose Buckner. After being shot in the arm, Gina Edwards, 21, who was the 4th victim, managed to get away and make a 911 call. Timothy Hartford, 14 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for his role in the killings of a Meals on Wheels volunteer and the man she was delivering lunch to. Tony Savalas Summers, 13 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for the essay and stabbing death of Lavelle Williams on November 7, 2006. He also stabbed 2 of her children, but they managed to survive. Mario McNeil, 11 years on death row. He is on death row for the September 2009 murder of 5-year-old Shania Davis of Fayetteville. The murder of Shania stands as one of the most well-known cases of human trafficking in Fayetteville. Shania was given to McNeil by her mother, Antoinette Nicole Davis, in order to pay off a $200 debt, as she informed the authorities. Shania was essayed, according to the evidence, and her body was discarded in a rural woods after she was choked. The case garnered national notice. Antoinette Davis entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of felonious child abuse and 1 count of second-degree murder in October 2013 due to her involvement in her daughter's death. She also entered a guilty plea to counts of human trafficking, first-degree kidnapping, first-degree essay, taking indecent liberties with a minor, and conspiracy to conduct essay of a child by an adult criminal. Davis is serving a sentence that can last up to 21 years and 9 months, but it can last at least 17 years and 6 months. In 2029, she is expected to be released from prison. Jonathan Richardson, 10 years on death row. He abused and tortured the 4-year-old daughter of his former girlfriend. When the girl's mother left for Army Reserve training in New Mexico, Richardson killed the girl while she was in his care for 10 days, according to the prosecution during his 2014 trial. At the time of the girl's death, Richardson, who was residing in an outbuilding behind his grandparents' house in Johnston County, was charged by investigators with giving her a forceful shake and striking her head on something. Her death was attributed to blunt force injuries to the head, according to the autopsy. Numerous lacerations, puncture wounds, burns, bite marks, and bruising, as well as signs of SA, were found on the girl's body. Again, she was 4 years old. Antoine Anthony, 8 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for a triple murder robbery. 3 workers at the Hustle Mart in Farmville, North Carolina, including the owner's adolescent son and his 2 cousins, were getting ready to close for the evening when the crime was committed. To rob the store, 3 armed men broke in with partially or completely masked faces. It also seems that they shot the staff members in spite of the victim's apparent lack of resistance. Not long after the offenders had left, at approximately 10 p.m., a customer found their bodies. The 3 individuals that perished were Gaber Alawi, 24 years old, Nabil Nasser Saed, 26 years old, and Mokbel Mohammed Al-Munjahi, 16 years old, also referred to as Sam at his high school. 4 suspects were apprehended by police on April 4th, thanks to surveillance footage from the crime scene and tips from the public. The murderers were Antoine Andre Anthony, 29 years old, Xavier Montel Shamble, 19 years old, Willie Whitehead, 23 years old, and another guy whose identity was withheld due to his underage status. Before his release on January 21, Antoine Anthony had served the majority of the previous 10 years in Connecticut jails. Less than 4 months had passed since his release until he committed his next crime. Siga Gillard, 5 years on death row. He was found guilty of killing April Lynn Holland, a pregnant woman, and her boyfriend Dwayne Garvey, who was helping her with her business. In December 2016, Garvey and Holland were shot and killed in a room at the Best Value Inn in Crabtree Valley, Raleigh. The crime was captured on camera, but Gillard's legal team contended that it was difficult to confirm he was the person in the unclear footage. David Godwin, 5 years on death row. In connection with Wendy Tamanya's 2016 murder, a jury found David Isaiah Godwin guilty and sentenced him to death. The woman, 37 years old, was fatally beaten, strangled, and stabbed before her body was dismembered and Godwin fled to Oregon. Michael Brady, 5 years on death row. Wiza Buckman, 1 year on death row. Following the violent deaths of 4 individuals during a planned prison break in North Carolina, they were given the death penalty. Brady, who worked in the prison's sewing facility, testified about organizing the escape, including how he pieced together supplies and bags. He had several fellow defendants, but only Wiza Buckman was also given the death penalty. Tillman Freeman, 2 years on death row. Because he killed his 2 children in 2017, he was given 2 death sentences. On March 24, 2017, Freeman took his kids from Fayetteville to a forested area off of Army Road in Hoke County. He stabbed his 2 daughters, Serenity, 2 years old, and Genesis, age 4, to death. He left the kids in the car and simply walked away. Joshua Burgess, 2 years on death row. Burgess was found guilty of first-degree murder in the killing of his 15-year-old daughter, Zaria Burgess. He slit her throat after psychologically and sexually torturing her for 22 hours at his Monroe, North Carolina home on August 18, 2019. Zaria was murdered during a weekend visit to her father's home. Following her death, Burgess walked into the Union County Sheriff's Office and confessed to killing her, telling deputies the girl's body was still at his house. James McCamey, 1 year on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Carol Smith Greer. Greer, 65 years old, a well-known retired school teacher, was stabbed to death just minutes after her neighbor was also stabbed but managed to escape and drive herself to the hospital. Another neighbor discovered Greer's body a day later in an area just outside the storage building behind her Smyrna Drive home. McCamey was tracked down in Brunswick County 3 days after the attacks, driving Greer's Subaru. McCamey's wife, Rocky McCamey, was also in the car, but was not charged with a crime. Terrence Taylor, 27 years on death row. He was given 2 separate death sentences by the trial court on February 18, 1997, one for each of the 2-degree murder convictions. He murdered 2 men who died from multiple gunshot wounds and were reported to have been together when they were murdered at the same time in one single incident. Johnny Parker, 27 years on death row. Parker was found guilty on 2 charges of first-degree murder and given the death penalty in connection with the killings of Jerry Lee Dowdy and James William Buchanan. Billy Herring, the chief of the Roseboro Fire Department, was notified in the morning of October 2, 1994, that smoke was emanating from a residence situated at 201 Northeast Street in Roseboro, North Carolina. When firefighters arrived on the scene, they discovered Jerry Dowdy and James Buchanan's bodies. The downstairs flat belonged to Buchanan, while the upstairs apartment was occupied by Dowdy. Buchanan was discovered in his downstairs flat, lying on the bed. His body and the bed were on fire, and he had been shot in the face. In his upstairs apartment, Dowdy was discovered face down in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. His private parts were removed, and he was nude from the waist down. He had blunt force injuries to his skull, as well as many chopping wounds to his hands and head. In the kitchen, officers discovered a bloody knife on the floor and blood and hair on an axe. A wallet that was empty was also discovered beneath Dowdy's left elbow. Roger Blakeney, 27 years on death row. On May 13, 1996, Blakeney was indicted for the first-degree murder of Kelly Washington Huntley. Blakeney broke through a back window of his mother's house on April 15, 1996, somewhere between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m., with the intention of stealing anything valuable that he might sell. In addition to his mother's savings account deposit book, he took 3 of her rings, a short herringbone chain, a brown leather pouch, and about $4 in change. Then he called his wife and informed her that he would return home shortly. Upon finishing his conversation with his spouse, the 76-year-old victim pulled up behind the residence. The victim had spent more than 2 decades living with Blakeney's mother. As the woman entered the house, Blakeney took cover in a small room behind the refrigerator. His confession, which was used as evidence during the trial, states that once Blakeney entered the kitchen, the two got into a fight. He reported to the police that the victim grabbed him as he proceeded to walk away. He rushed towards the victim, took a pistol from his grasp, and struck the victim in the back of the head with the gun's butt. Kelly Washington Huntley began to bleed after collapsing face down onto the kitchen floor. Blakeney claims that after a little more fighting, kerosene unintentionally leaked out of a metal can. He further stated that at some point during the battle, a cigarette he was smoking dropped out of his mouth. He claims that he lifted the victim off the ground, placed her in a chair, and bound her hands and legs with an electrical cord. Blakeney then took $78 from the victim's wallet, drove away from the house, and left the neighborhood. 75% of the victim's skin was burnt, according to the autopsy. Additionally, the victim had sustained injuries to the brain from wounds to the back and left temporal area of the head. She was awake for 3 to 5 minutes after the fire started, and the fire's production of carbon monoxide poisoning was the cause of death. Marcus Mitchell, 27 years on death row. On April 1, 1997, Marcus DeCarlos Mitchell was charged with 3 charges of first-degree murder in relation to the deaths of Robin Watkins, Dwayne Rogers, and Damian Armstrong. Following the victims' autopsies, the pathologist found that Watkins and Rogers had both been shot in the back of the head. Rodney Taylor, 26 years on death row. He was indicted for first-degree murder and for robbery with a dangerous weapon. On January 1st of 1998, Rodney and his brother, Cashin Taylor, left the Hillcrest housing complex in Wilmington, North Carolina, with Brian Troy shortly before 6 p.m. and drove to Bryan Road. Rodney and Troy got out of the car and talked briefly. As Troy knelt on the road, Rodney shot him in the head and upper body. Rodney and Cashin Taylor then returned to the apartment in the Hillcrest housing complex. Jeffrey Meyer, 25 years on death row. 2 first-degree murder charges, 1 first-degree burglary charge, and 2 counts of robbery with a dangerous weapon were brought against him. Meyer and Mark Thompson were Fort Bragg-based soldiers serving in the active service. With plans to break into the home of an elderly couple, Meyer and Thompson started keeping an eye on their residence. Meyer and Thompson's surveillance activities had led them to believe that Paul and Janie Cutts, the victims, were an elderly couple with 2 cars that they usually traveled in together. Meyer and Thompson, dressed in ninja suits, broke into the victim's home in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Surprised by Mr. Cutts, Meyer shot him with a blowgun, a martial arts weapon that launches sharp darts from a hollow tube. When Mr. Cutts continued to advance, Meyer stabbed and killed him with a butterfly knife. Meyer and Thompson also stabbed and killed Mrs. Cutts with butterfly knives. They stole jewelry, credit cards, and a television from the residence. They were soldiers. They were supposed to protect people. William Anthony, 25 years on death row. William Todd Anthony was indicted for first-degree murder of Samantha Belk Anthony and for assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill, inflicting serious injuries on John Edward Belk. Anthony and Samantha Belk Anthony were married on October 26, 1985, and 2 children were born out of the marriage. Anthony and Samantha separated for several months in 1992. During their separation, Anthony wrecked Samantha's vehicle with his truck and grabbed her after allegedly seeing her with another man. Samantha told her father, John Edward Belk, that she was afraid for her life. Anthony eventually murdered both Samantha and her father. Isaiah Barden, 25 years on death row. He was found guilty of first-degree murder under felony murder rule and guilty of robbery with a dangerous weapon. Isaiah Barden and the victim, Felipe Resendez, were employed by Master Casings, a business located in Clinton, North Carolina. Barden was a machine operator, while the victim was a contract worker who cleaned the equipment in the evenings. The victim's responsibilities often required that he worked until 1 or 2 a.m., and he would close the business when he left. On Friday, March 27, 1998, the employees expected it to be a payday at Master Casings. Around 4:30 that afternoon, the victim cashed his paycheck at a bank, then began work at the plant at 6 p.m. He was still on the job when the plant janitor left the building at 10:30 p.m. The next morning, 2 workers found the lifeless victim lying face down in the plant. Although Barden at first denied any involvement in the victim's death, upon further questioning, he confessed. Andre Fletcher, 25 years on death row. On August 17, 1994, Georgia Ann Dayberry Hamrick, 83, was battered and knifed to death in her home in Spindale, Rutherford County, North Carolina. The state's evidence showed that Fletcher broke into the victim's home, beat her to find out where her valuables were, and then cut her throat. He took several rings, 2 of which he sold over the next couple of days for $250 and another one for $60. Terry Robinson, 24 years on death row. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. They also found him guilty of attempted robbery with a dangerous weapon. Following a capital sentencing proceeding, the jury recommended a sentence of death for the first-degree murder conviction. Mark Squires, 24 years on death row. Mark Lorenzo Squires was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder on July 27, 1998, in relation to the murders of Eric Keach and Randy House. Squires was found guilty on both charges of first-degree murder after a capital trial. The conviction for House's murder was based on felony murder with premeditation and deliberation, with the sale of cocaine serving as the underlying offense. The sale of cocaine and House's murder served as the underlying charges for Keach's murder conviction, which was based only on felony murder. The jury recommended that Squires be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release for House's murder and to death for Keach's murder during a capital sentencing hearing. Timothy White, 24 years on death row. On October 25, 1999, Timothy Lionel White was charged with Evie Lane Vaughn's first-degree murder. White's great-aunt, who was 72 years old, resided next door to him in a mobile home on Tobaccoville Road in Forsyth County, where he shared residence with his parents. White removed 4 firearms from his father's gun closet early on July 21, 1999. He took the firearms out of his bedroom and soon started to play with them. After that, White placed one of the weapons in his back pocket, moved to the next door, and pointed the pistol at the victim as she opened it. The victim shouted, raised her arms, and reached for the gun. She was shot in the chest by White. He tried to shoot the victim again after she hit the ground, but his pistol jammed. After that, White went over to the victim and stomped on the head until he believed she had passed away. After taking out $100 in cash and a set of car keys from the victim's pocketbook, White started the victim's Cadillac, which was kept in the garage, and went back to his house to load the remaining firearms in a duffel-style bag along with some clothes. In addition, he acknowledged his mistakes in a letter to his girlfriend. White went back to the victim's residence. He went out through the garage after locking the doors from the inside. He took the victim's Cadillac and headed to West Virginia. Michael Holmes, 24 years on death row. He was convicted of robbery with a deadly weapon, first-degree murder of Dean Ray Creech, and attempted first-degree murder of Ronnie Lynn Hardison, which landed him on death row. 2 gunshot wounds were found on Creech's body, but the pathologist conducting the autopsy was unable to ascertain the sequence in which they were sustained. A bullet that entered the right side of the chest, passed through the right lung, passed through the aorta, causing blood to pool around the heart, and left a large irregular exit wound on the upper left side of the chest. A bullet that entered the left lower back, passed through the left lung, and exited the left side of the chest, with pieces lodged in the left arm, was the origin of the second wound that the pathologist reported. The doctor also testified that a high-velocity weapon fired the first bullet from a distance greater than 2 feet. According to him, Creech passed away as a result of these wounds, and either wound would have been lethal on its own. Johnny Hyde, 26 years on death row. Hyde was drinking with Joel Coleman and James Blake at a shed near his house on August 1, 1996. Hyde overheard Blake and Coleman talking about where to get more drugs because the blue pills they were taking didn't make them feel very high. Leslie Egbert Howard was reported by Blake and Coleman to have drugs in his home at all times. The victim's mobile home break-in was organized by Blake and Coleman. The two requested Hyde's help getting into the victim's house to take weed at some point after midnight. Hyde agreed. Blake and Coleman wore gloves and coats that resembled camouflage. Blake had a pipe and an axe head, while Hyde brought a knife and a handsaw. Coleman, Blake, and Hyde then strolled up to the victim's mobile home. Blake pried open the front door with the help of the pipe and axe head. Upon leading the way down the hallway to the victim's bedroom, Hyde discovered the victim sitting upright in bed. Hyde then lunged at the victim, stabbing him multiple times with the knife. The victim went to his knees and was struck in the back of the head with the pipe by either Blake or Coleman. At that point, the victim collapsed on his back to the ground. Hyde used a drill bit from the shed to stab the victim twice in the side and back. The victim's throat was then repeatedly sliced by Hyde with the handsaw until the stench and sight of blood sickened him. For around 3 minutes, Coleman continued to sever the victim's throat while Blake remained vigilant in the living room. The 3 men then fled from the victim's home back to Hyde's shed after hearing a car approaching. Blake burned off the blood by setting fire to every weapon in a barrel before placing it on a garbage can to be collected the following day. Patrick Steen, 26 years on death row. He is on death row for a robbery murder. During the autopsy on March 1, 1996, it was discovered that the victim had broken teeth, bruising over her head, neck, left arm, shoulder, chest, and buttocks, and contusions over the bridge of her nose, above her left eye, and over the left side of her cheek. There was also a cut on the right side of her scalp. In addition, the autopsy discovered 16 distinct fractures to 10 different ribs, minor tears in the inner lining of the chest, and areas of bleeding around the brain, as well as swelling and bruises. The head injuries were classified as blunt trauma injuries in the autopsy report because they resulted from a blunt object striking the body. The report added that the victim would have lived for 3 or 4 hours and that none of the blows would have been instantly deadly. Danny Frodge, 26 years on death row. He killed his bedridden stepmother and father with stabbings. He resided at his father's and stepmother's Winston-Salem house at the time of the murders. His stepmother had been confined to her bed for more than 2 years, and his father was unemployed. Frodge did not pay rent. Instead, he helped out around the house and worked part-time. The Winston-Salem Police Department received a 911 call on November 5, 1994, between 4 and 4:30 in the morning, from someone identifying himself as Danny Frodge. He announced the passing of his parents. Robert and Audrey Frodge's bodies were discovered in their bedroom by Winston-Salem police officers upon their arrival at the site. Bloodstain covered Robert Frodge's arms and shirt when he was discovered laying on his left side on the ground. He had been stabbed 10 times. Beside his body was discovered a leather wallet that held his driver's license and other random documents, but no cash. There was a drop and a smear of blood within the open wallet. There was a white sock with blood on it beside the wallet. Under Robert Frodge's corpse was discovered an iron lawnmower bar. Audrey Frodge was discovered in her hospital-style bed, her arms and torso covered in bloodstains. She had been stabbed 11 times in the chest. She also sustained hand injuries from defensive knife wounds. Beside the bed was a mobile table reminiscent of a hospital. According to forensic pathologist Dr. Patrick Lantz, the angle of the stab wounds suggested Audrey Frodge was stabbed by someone who either climbed on the bed or stood at the edge next to the table. Jimmy Lawrence, 27 years on death row. For the first-degree murder of Dale Jerome McLean, he received a death sentence. In connection with the kidnapping of victim Gwen Morrison, he was also found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and first-degree kidnapping. After dating for nearly 2 years, Lawrence and Gwen Morrison called it quits in early December 1996. Morrison moved in with Dale McLean at the end of December the same year. The gunshot wounds on McLean's right arm, nose, and forehead were not the fatal injuries. The cause of death was any one of the 4 bullets that entered McLean's brain through the right side of his skull. A forensic firearm examiner from the SBI determined that the shell casings collected at the scene from around McLean's body had been fired from Lawrence's 9mm pistol. Clifford Ray Miller, 23 years on death row. Miller was found guilty of first-degree kidnapping, felonious larceny, first-degree murder, robbery with a dangerous weapon, and felonious conspiracy to conduct robbery with a dangerous weapon. Reach Smith, 23 years on death row. He was convicted of first-degree murder and felony larceny. The autopsy revealed only one significant external injury, a scratch on the victim's left shin. Internal injuries were consistent with manual choking, bruises and bleeding into the muscles surrounding the voice box, and bits of hemorrhage inside the structure of the thyroid cartilage. The victim's hands were swollen and purple-red in color, indicating he was alive at the time Smith bound him with the tape and electrical cord. The doctor stated that the victim's death was caused by asphyxia, resulting from blockage of the nose and mouth due to tape bound around the head. Once Smith placed tape on the victim's nose and mouth, he became brain dead in 2 to 3 minutes, and his heart stopped after 10 to 20 minutes. The medical examiner also determined that the victim could have remained conscious for a portion of that time. He could have regained consciousness after Smith choked him and been aware of his condition, but because of his lack of oxygen, the victim would have been unable to move. Terrence Campbell, 22 years on death row. He was indicted on February 21, 2000 for first-degree murder and robbery with a dangerous weapon. Evidence collected at the crime scene and from Campbell's body was sent to the State Bureau of Investigation for DNA testing. DNA profiles taken from the cigarette butts collected from around the victim's body were consistent with the victim and Campbell. Blood found on Campbell's jeans matched the victim's. An autopsy performed on the victim revealed approximately 11 blunt trauma wounds to the head. The wounds were found on the front, top, and back of the head, along with a skull fracture located under the wounds on the left front of the head. According to the pathologist who performed the autopsy, the injuries resulted in massive cerebral damage and intercerebral hemorrhage. Eddie Lamar Crowley, 19 years on death row. He was charged on January 12, 2004 with murder. In addition, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping, 1 count of conspiracy to conduct robbery with a dangerous weapon, 2 counts of robbery with a dangerous weapon, and 1 case of attempted robbery with a dangerous weapon. Terry Moore, 21 years on death row. In Mocksville, North Carolina, Simon Wilford Brown owned and operated a wholesale grocery store with the assistance of his family, which included his son Charles. Charles showed up at the store at about 7:30 a.m. on March 6, 1998. He went through the front door and shut it afterwards. After a quarter of an hour, he heard his dad go into the shop. Charles heard his father calling for him a little while later and hurried to the front of the business. Brown indicated the front door with a gesture, saying that a man had stabbed him and fled to the right out of the entrance. On March 15, 1998, 9 days later, Brown passed away. The autopsy's performing forensic pathologist, Patrick Eugene Lantz, stated in his testimony that complications from a chest stab wound were the cause of death. Terry Moore had previously robbed another store 2 times. Byron Lamar Waring, 17 years on death row. Raleigh police were called to an apartment building close to Walnut Creek Parkway early on November 8, 2005, to look into a report of suspected assault and essay. Officer David Naumuk arrived to the site first, followed by Raleigh Fire Department personnel. Officer Naumuk spotted a white male who would subsequently be identified as Andrew Bennett Pipkin, coming toward the firefighters and clutching a phone to his ear as he attempted to find the correct building in the complex. After asking Pipkin to lead him to the victim, Officer Naumuk trailed him down a flight of stairs and through a breezeway. The officer discovered Pipkin kneeling next to the victim, a 23-year-old Caucasian woman named Lauren Redman, when he arrived at the foot of the steps. Trying to contain the victim's intestines, Pipkin's hand was on her stomach. She was covered in blood, sitting up Indian style on the sidewalk with her head slouched and her hair covering her face. Her arms were stretched out over her knees. The officer stood watch over the victim's apartment door as emergency medical services and firefighters started seeing to their needs. The victim was pronounced dead in the ambulance. Waring received the death penalty for this crime. William Robinson, 13 years on death row. On May 16, 1999, Robinson informed Ronald Bullock that he needed Bullock's assistance to rob the Wilson, North Carolina Pizza Inn. Bullock accepted the arrangement. Getting the clothing and weapons to utilize in the robbery, the two started getting ready for the crime. At 9 p.m., the two entered the Pizza Inn through the takeout entrance. Both Bullock and Robinson approached the cash register with their firearms drawn and their faces covered. The victim, John Rushton, who was also the Pizza Inn manager, came around the back of the establishment to the cash register. Rushton was told to place the cash in a bag by Robinson, who was pointing a gun at him. When Rushton moved towards him, Robinson shot him in the head. Bullock and Robinson then ran away. Jeffrey Neal Duke, 21 years on death row. He was found guilty in 2003 of killing Ralph Arthurs in his apartment, as well as Harold Grant, Arthurs' neighbor. Linwood Earl Fort, 21 years on death row. Known as the Night Stalker, he is the main suspect in a 1994 murder and was connected by DNA to a string of essays and killings that occurred in Goldsboro, North Carolina in 1990. Fort's first known attack happened on May 26, 1990, at the residence of 70-year-old Eliza Jones. He tried to strangle her in her bed, but had to leave when her daughter came home. When asked who the offender was, Jones said she couldn't recall and couldn't offer any leads. Hattie Davis Bonner, 79 years old, was discovered suffocated in her bed on July 14, about 2 months later, in a way strangely resembling of the first incident. On October 6, Fort forced entry into the house of Alvin Bowen, 78 years old, and his blind wife Thelma, 75. Before killing Thelma by strangulation, Fort repeatedly stabbed the old man. He then set fire to the house and their car using flammable liquid in an attempt to hide the crime scene. The neighbors saw the ensuing fire and promptly reported it to the authorities, who were able to put it out before it spread to the couple's bedroom. The police found it difficult to obtain any pertinent information that would help them apprehend a credible suspect. Thus, the local chapter of Crime Stoppers was offering a $2,000 prize to anyone who could provide information that resulted in an arrest. All 4 cases eventually went cold due to a lack of leads or potential suspects, and at the time they were regarded as some of the most well-known unsolved homicides in the state. Fort was found guilty in 1996 of discharging a gun inside his Dudley residence. He was required to provide a DNA sample because he was a convicted felon. After his DNA was connected to the Night Stalker killings 5 years later, he was arrested on April 30, 2001 at his Dudley employer. Detectives allegedly discovered evidence connecting him to the 1994 murder of 46-year-old Dora Ann Thomas, who was discovered essayed and strangled at her Goldsboro apartment on June 30, 1994, while he was awaiting trial at Central Prison. Scott Allen, 21 years on death row. Following his 1999 arrest, Scott David Allen was given a death sentence in 2003 for the murder of Christopher Gailey. Scott has consistently claimed that he is innocent and that there isn't any forensic proof linking him to the crime. Important evidence was mismanaged, disregarded, or even lost by the authorities, such as a bloody knife discovered at the scene. Terrence Elliott, 21 years on death row. Terrence Rodriguez Elliott killed Alice Mae McLeod McCrimmon on January 28, 2001. She was a 77-year-old widow who didn't have a dependable heating system in her mobile home. She was a frugal woman who cautiously gathered pennies. Elliott broke through her window and then battered, strangled, and essayed her until she passed away. There were several blood splatters on her bedroom walls and headboard. Additionally, he managed to knock out one of Mrs. McCrimmon's teeth, which was subsequently discovered embedded in her back. Elliott smoked a cigarette and dropped 2 used condoms on the ground, leaving his unfinished cigarette at the crime scene. Paul Dwayne Cummings, 20 years on death row. On October 4, 2002, Paul Cummings stabbed his next-door neighbor, a 62-year-old Wilmington woman, 16 times, torturing her to reveal her ATM PIN number so he could withdraw money to buy drugs. Christopher Goss, 19 years on death row. Using kitchen knives, Christopher Edward Goss fatally stabbed his neighbor, Deborah Sturgill Veller, on September 22, 2003 at her house, leaving over 50 puncture wounds on her back, neck, face, hands, and arms. William Raines, 19 years on death row. On September 6, 2005, a jury found Raines guilty of the first-degree murder of Philip Lester Holder and Pamela K. Holder, as well as the robbery of Philip Holder with a deadly weapon. 6 linear blunt force wounds to his scalp, some fracturing his skull, were inflicted on Philip. In addition, he suffered 2 bullet wounds to the back of his head and 1 above and between his eyes. Both of these gunshots sent projectiles into his brain. There was a 3rd bullet wound on his hand, close to the base of his thumb, on the palm. Pamela did not have a fractured skull, despite having 4 linear blunt force wounds to her head. She had been shot twice, once in the right shoulder and once in the back of the head, where the bullet eventually entered her brain. Her being shot while seated was consistent with both gunshots. Jeremy Duchesne Morrell, 18 years on death row. On August 21, 2003, late in the evening, Morrell went up to Lawrence Matthew Harding, who was sitting in his own car in a parking lot next to his workplace. After driving Harding to Durham, Morrell used a gun to shoot him twice in the head and neck, killing him. He then put his body in the trunk and stole a watch and about $130 from him. Morrell left the car and Harding's body outside a bus stop in Richmond, Virginia, 3 days later. It was not until August 29, 2003, more than a week after the murder, that the victim was found. Darrell Manis, 18 years on death row. He was indicted for 1 count of murder, 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 3 counts of assault with a deadly weapon with the intent to kill, 3 counts of assault with a firearm on a law enforcement officer, and 1 count of robbery with a dangerous weapon. He was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder on the basis of malice, premeditation, and deliberation, and also under the felony murder rule. Following a capital sentencing hearing, the jury recommended the death sentence. Ryan Garcelle, 18 years on death row. On June 22, 2004, Ryan Gabriel Garcelle robbed 71-year-old Margaret Hutchins Bennick in her residence with the use of a firearm and then strangled her to death. On March 30, 2006, a Rutherford County jury declared him guilty of first-degree murder, robbery with a dangerous weapon, and conspiracy to commit robbery with a dangerous weapon. Garcelle was sentenced to death for the first-degree murder. Eugene Johnny Williams, 17 years on death row. On December 8, 2004, Eugene Johnny Williams was convicted of the first-degree murders of Nicholas Gillard and Cedric Levy. Mario Phillips, 17 years on death row. Phillips killed 4 people during a heist, landing him on death row. After learning that his brother had been shot in the head in a separate incident, Phillips carried out the killings on December 19, 2003. Phillips used ecstasy, Mary Jane, and alcohol on a binge after mistakenly believing that his brother had passed away. He went to his mother's home at the Carolina Lakes Trailer Park in Carthage early that morning to inform her of the bad news. His friend Sean Ray and girlfriend Renee McLaughlin were with him. The 3 of them went to acquire Mary Jane from neighbor Daryl Hobson's house after he spoke with his mother. Although Hobson didn't have any, he led them to a different house in the park where he believed some may be. Eddie Riles, 21, his girlfriend Amanda Cook, 15 years old, Carl Justice, 18, and Joseph Harden, 19, were all inside the trailer. What started out as a drugs purchase swiftly escalated into an armed robbery. Court documents state that Phillips took a pistol out of his waistband and fired 2 shots, striking Riles in the stomach and chest. In addition, he kicked Riles, took a shotgun, and struck him in the face while asking for money and narcotics. After that, Phillips continued shooting, striking Harden and Justice. Both individuals died as a result of their wounds. Then, they led Hobson and Cook into the kitchen and told them to lie down. Hobson was shot by Phillips in the neck at close range after being stabbed in the chest. Ray was told by Phillips to kill Cook. Nevertheless, she managed to rise off the ground and fought Ray before Phillips shot her twice. After that, Ray gave the girl 22 stab wounds and a slit to her throat, and the 2 guys doused the trailer with gasoline to start a fire. Unaware that Phillips and Ray had noticed her, Cook, who had survived the attack, managed to escape the burning trailer and entered the rear of a vehicle. After picking her up, the men loaded her into the back of another vehicle with bags of rubbish and transported her to the trailer park's trash dump. They left her in the truck while firefighters started battling the fire. Cook ultimately made it through the attack and testified as an eyewitness at the trials of Phillips, Ray, who was given a life sentence, and McLaughlin, who was given 16 years for her role in the killings. Angel Guevara, 28 years on death row. Guevara received a death sentence for the murder of Paul West, a Johnston County deputy. He was found guilty of shooting West's manager, Lieutenant Ronald Medlin, and assaulting him with a deadly weapon with the intent to kill or seriously hurt him. While testifying that he shot West to protect his girlfriend's son from the cop, Guevara acknowledged shooting West. Medlin stated in his testimony that he witnessed the entire incident from outside of Guevara's mobile home and that West was holding his right palm overhead rather than a gun. Guevara fled the shooting and made his way to New York, where he was apprehended while using a payphone at Penn Station. Wallach Thomas, 28 years on death row. He was convicted of stabbing his childhood friend's mother, leading to a 5-year prison sentence. In 1994, he was accused with 3 additional violent offenses, including robbing 2 individuals at gunpoint and attempting to assay a lady, less than 6 months after his parole. Thomas was always released from prison before his trial. He signed his name twice, pledging to appear in court again if needed. The last time, Thomas's lawyer convinced the judge to impose a $500 cash bond for him. Thomas was detained and accused of being responsible for the death of Kenny Tuttle, a college student, a year after he was released from prison. In the kitchen of the house Tuttle rented in Greensboro, the body was found by the police. There was a black telephone cord around his hands. He had sustained 36 stab wounds. James Davis, 28 years on death row. After being fired from the tool manufacturing plant in Asheville a few days prior in 1995, James killed Frank Knox, Tony Bello, and Gerald Allman when he broke into the building. Everyone who knew James at the time of the killings assumed he suffered from a severe mental illness. He shot phantom groundhogs in his yard, chatted to himself, and lived in near seclusion in the years prior to his crime. James turned himself in and on the day of the shooting he seemed to be hearing voices and having hallucinations, according to investigators who spoke with him. He had to be given so much medication before his trial that it was impossible for him to speak clearly and sustain a cohesive conversation. In addition to suffering from terrible childhood abuse and mental illness, Davis never fully recovered from the psychological wounds he sustained during 2 grueling combat tours in Vietnam, even though he did survive a shrapnel wound. Melvin White, 28 years on death row. In 1996, White received a death sentence for killing an elderly Craven County woman and her boyfriend. White continues to claim innocence. On 2 counts of first-degree murder, he was found guilty. His attorneys contend that the science used to convict White is flawed and may have been untrustworthy in their attempt to secure a second trial for him, although they have not been successful in doing so thus far. A hearing has not been granted to him. The only forensic evidence connecting him to the killings is a countrywide trail of bullets and an SBI analyst's statement that every single one of them originated from a single gun. The detectives never uncovered any guns in White's case, and White was never found in possession of one. Lawrence Peterson, 28 years on death row. On February 9, 1996, he was charged with first-degree murder in connection with the July 5, 1995 robbery of Jewel Scarborough Braswell, a 67-year-old owner of a general store and groceries in Richmond County. The doctor who conducted Mrs. Braswell's autopsy stated that he discovered 5 gunshot wounds that went all the way through her body. Massive bleeding and injury to the lungs, liver, colon, and spinal cord resulted from 4 of those wounds. The investigators discovered multiple bullet pieces and 5 bullet holes behind Mrs. Braswell's seat at the counter area of the store where she was shot. 5 shell casings were discovered by investigators inside the business. Henry Wallace, 27 years on death row. Nicknamed the Taco Bell Strangler, he killed Thashonda Bethea at the beginning of 1990 and threw her into a lake near his hometown. Her body was not found for weeks. Although the police questioned him about her death and abduction, he was never legally charged with her murder. He was also questioned over the attempted essay of a 16-year-old girl from Barnwell, but no charges were brought against him for that incident either. By then, he had lost his employment as a chemical operator and his marriage had broken down. He broke into both his former high school and the radio station he worked for in February of 1991. He was apprehended attempting to pawn video and recording equipment that he had stolen. He moved to Charlotte, North Carolina in November of 1991. He was able to secure employment at a number of East Charlotte fast food outlets. He picked up Sharon Nance, a former drug dealer and prostitute, in May 1992. Wallace killed her by beating her, then he abandoned her body by the railway lines. He did this because she asked for money for her services. A few days later, she was discovered. At Caroline Love's flat, he choked her to death and disposed of her body in a forested area. He and her sisters went to the police station and filed a missing persons report. It would take until March of 1994, or nearly 2 years, for her remains to be found in a Charlotte woodland. On February 19, 1993, he visited Shauna Hawk at her house where he killed her, and then he attended her funeral. He murdered Audrey Spain, a co-worker, on June 22. After 2 days, her body was discovered. Wallace killed Valencia Jumper on August 10, 1993, and then set her on fire to hide his crime. He and his sister attended Valencia's funeral. He visited Michelle Stinson's apartment in September 1993, a month later. Michelle was a single mother of 2 sons and a struggling college student. In front of her oldest kid, he stabbed her and strangled her. His only child was born that October. Wallace killed Vanessa Little Mack at her apartment on February 20, 1994. At the time of her passing, Mack had 2 kids, ages 7 and 4 months. Wallace robbed and strangled Betty Jean Bocom on March 8, 1994. Then he stole some things from the property and took her car. Everything was pawned by him, with the exception of the car, which he left at a mall. On the same day, Wallace returned to the same apartment building, knowing that Vernon Woods would be at work, intending to kill his girlfriend, Brandy June Henderson. That evening, Wallace choked both Henderson and her son Therese. He robbed the apartment before leaving. 2 bodies of young black women were discovered at the Lake apartment complex, prompting the police to step up patrols in East Charlotte. Wallace nevertheless entered covertly to rob, strangle, and stab Deborah Ann Slaughter. The date of her discovery was March 12, 1994. The next day, Wallace was taken into custody. He admitted to killing 10 women in Charlotte over the course of 12 hours of interrogation. He gave a detailed account of the woman's appearances, his drug addiction, and how he essayed, robbed, and killed the women. Leroy Mann, 27 years on death row. Janet Noble Hauser was robbed by Leroy and Cindy Mann, after which she was thrown from the Falls Lake Bridge in the northern region of Wake County. Christopher Roseborough, 27 years on death row. He is on death row for the essay and murder of a 72-year-old Gastonia woman. In March 1992, Martha Edwards was murdered at her residence on West 2nd Avenue. Evidence presented during the trial suggested that Edwards was essayed while she was dying, or possibly even after her death, and Roseborough also robbed the residence. Errol Moses, 27 years on death row. In 1997, Moses was found guilty of first-degree murder in connection with the shooting deaths of Jacinto Dunkley and Ricky Nelson Griffin. Testimony suggested that drugs had a role in the killings. Moses was given 2 death sentences. Michael Braxton, 27 years on death row. Braxton was already serving a life sentence for killing a man during a robbery in Raleigh when he was sentenced to death in 1996 for the murder of another prisoner at the Caledonia Correctional Center in Halifax. He was operating an unlawful canteen and cards business at Caledonia, according to court filings. Dwayne Morris Caldwell was a man who owed him $17. When other prisoners combined their funds to settle Caldwell's obligation, Braxton returned their funds, explaining that it was a principal thing. In the shower, he proceeded to stab Caldwell 18 to 20 times. John Williams, 26 years on death row. He is believed to be a serial murderer who killed at least 4 people in Raleigh, North Carolina's downtown. Patricia Aish was killed in January of 1996, and Williams was charged with her murder in March 1997. He was also accused of killing Deborah Elliott in December of the same year while he was incarcerated. Authorities suspect that Williams was also responsible for the deaths of Dawn Grandy and Cynthia Brown, 2 other women whose remains were found on or close to downtown train lines. In addition, he was accused of essaying 4 more women. Timmy Grooms, 26 years on death row. On April 11, 1994, Grooms was charged with first-degree kidnapping, first-degree murder, and robbery with a deadly weapon in connection with the abduction and subsequent death of Krista K. Goodwin. Grooms lived next door to her in Laurel Hill, North Carolina. Goodwin was preparing a special Valentine's Day dinner for her fiancé, Michael McDaniel, on February 14, 1994. The doctor who conducted her autopsy discovered that the same weapon, possibly a pocket knife, was used to cause all 12 of the stab wounds on her body. She suffered many potentially lethal stab wounds that punctured her chest cavity, but one of the wounds would have killed Goodwin in a matter of minutes because it punctured her aorta. The pathologist discovered many linear scrapes and scratches on her back and legs, which were in line with the body being dragged. She had sustained blunt force injuries while still alive, as seen by the numerous bruises and scrapes on her face surrounding her nose and eyes. The presence of internal bleeding and hemorrhaging in the neck tissues suggested that she had been choked before being stabbed. Goodwin's left hand had been partially removed, followed by the bone being forcefully fractured or snapped. Her right hand had been severed at the forearm. Robert Brewington, 26 years on death row. He was charged on June 30, 1997, with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, 1 count of first-degree burglary conspiracy, 1 crime of first-degree arson conspiracy, and 1 offense of first-degree arson. The allegations were related to the June 12, 1997 killings of his 8-year-old nephew Brian Brewington and Frances Brewington, his 82-year-old great-grandmother. They were discovered dead from burns at Mrs. Brewington's farmhouse close to Dunn. Vera Lee, one of the co-defendants listed in the case, and her friend Michael McKeaton intentionally started a fire, which resulted in the deaths of the two. After being found guilty of murder and arson, both received life sentences without the possibility of parole. Brewington was convicted on 2 counts of conspiracy and 2 counts of murder. They all planned the deaths in order to receive insurance payments. Paul Brown, 24 years on death row. He killed Latashonette Cox, his ex-girlfriend, by shooting her. A baby named David Dishon Franklin was also hit by gunshots and died. Sean Carter, 23 years on death row. He is incarcerated since a gunfight in 1997 erupted over drug money, killing both his opponent and an 8-year-old bystander. Fernando Garcia, 23 years on death row. Julian Bolt, 32 years old, was discovered dead in the clubhouse of the Cameron Lake Apartments, close to Crabtree Valley Mall, shortly before 10 o'clock at night. Following his arrest, Raleigh resident Fernando Luis Garcia, also 32, was accused with murder, first-degree essay, and attempted robbery. The clubhouse had a gym where Bolt was working out. She allegedly suffered essay and was fatally struck by a hammer. A man was observed fleeing the area by a Raleigh police officer who resided in the building and wasn't on duty. That helped detectives identify their suspect. Garcia resided in the same building. Jim Hasselden, 23 years on death row. Because of the 1999 murder of Kim Dalton Sisk, his neighbor, he is incarcerated on death row. Sisk, 32 years old, was shot twice in the face by Hasselden in her car. Prosecutors claimed that although the first fire severely damaged her jaw, she survived. After 10 minutes, Hasselden pulled the trigger again and took her life. Her body was discovered by 2 hunters in remote Stokes County woods close to the Rockingham County border 1 day later. Sisk told her relatives a few days before that Hasselden wanted to pay her $100 for driving him to Virginia. She intended to purchase Christmas presents for her 6-year-old daughter Heather with that money. James Hollis Watts, 23 years on death row. Watts was given the death penalty by a jury for the 1999 murder of a Linwood woman. Joyce Owens was 53 years old. On November 22, 1999, Owens's body was discovered in her Linwood, just south of Lexington, home on Belmont Road. The autopsy report stated that she had been shot multiple times and that her throat had been cut. At the time of her death, the house had been broken into and 6 guns and 2 crossbows seized. About a month after Owens's passing, Watts and another suspect, Alton Klein McIntyre, were taken into custody. McIntyre was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brian Christopher Bell, 23 years on death row. August 2001 saw the conviction of Brian Christopher Bell and Antoine Kyrell Sims as a co-defendant on several counts, including first-degree murder. Following a capital sentencing hearing, the jury recommended that Bell be executed and Sims be given life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Elise Kennedy, a resident of Newton Grove, who was abducted and beaten on January 3, 2000. While Kennedy was still alive, the 89-year-old was put in the trunk of her 1998 Cadillac, drove about, and the vehicle was set on fire at the end of a dirt road down a forested path. Kennedy was found dead in her charred Cadillac the next day. During the capital murder trial in 2001, Chad Lamont Williams, a third suspect, testified against Sims and Bell and implicated himself in the crime. Bell and Sims refrained from taking a stance. Williams received a life sentence in prison in an additional proceeding that took place in October 2001. Bell was just 19 years old when the murder occurred. Williams and Sims were 18 years old. Wesley Toby Smith, 22 years on death row. On September 12, 2001, Margaret Martin was stabbed more than 60 times in the chest, head, and back by Smith. In May 2002, Smith was found guilty and given the death penalty. John Henry Thompson, 22 years on death row. Thompson entered the Chapman Street Domino's Pizza and took out a sawed-off shotgun from under his jacket. He shot Kenneth Brommuller in the head. Thompson tried to unlock the store safe after stealing his wallet. At Thompson's house the following morning, police arrested him. The authorities discovered the victim's driver's license and social security card in his wallet, a shotgun in the trunk of his car, and a spent round casing in his pocket. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.